And just take a minute to arrive to the space. And I'll invite everyone just to take a collective breath and just sense into this digital space that we're in this evening. Thank you. And we are convening this conversation at a time of devastating settler colonial violence. The genocide in Gaza has taken the lives of over 36,000 Palestinians, 15,000 of them being children, with 10,000 Palestinian people still missing. On the occupied West Bank, at least 512 Palestinian people have been murdered since October 7th, 127 of them being children. We also arrived to this conversation acknowledging the aftermath and ongoing structures of colonialism that continue to fuel violence across the continent of Africa, most notably in Sudan and the Congo. An estimated 40,000 children are reported to be working in cobalt mines in the Congo, and 3.5 million children under the age of 5 in Sudan are currently suffering from acute malnutrition. These paradigms of war that are causing grief, trauma, and loss across the globe only make this cipher that we're about to have this evening on Indigenous sovereignties, Black ecologies, and Black anarchisms even more important. And we convene this conversation with the understanding that scarcity is a narrative, not a truth, and that scarcity is dividing us. Our most benevolent ancestors have governed themselves into paradigms of peace in the past, and we have the power to remember and organize ourselves into a timeline of harmony. So with that, I want to introduce our panelists, J.T. Roane, Kēhaulani Kauanui, and William C. Anderson, who will be bringing us on a journey beyond the settler state. And before I do that, I need to attend to our language justice and tech support. I'm going to just quickly make sure that we have our interpreters added to the appropriate slots before we get started reading the bios. Okay. Okay, excellent. We are all set. Sorry about that, Danielle. And sorry to folks who are listening in Arabic who may have missed that. And thank you for bearing with us as we practice language justice. So just to introduce our participants, J.T. Roane is the Mellon Assistant Professor of Global Racial Justice, Africana Studies, and Geography at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. Dr. Roane is a historian focusing on geography, sexuality, and religion in relation to Black communities. He leads the Black Ecologies Lab and is a former co-senior editor at Black Perspectives. You can learn more and purchase their book, Dark Agoras, Insurgent Black Social Life and the Politics of Place. J. Kēhaulani Kauanui is a scholar activist who teaches about Indigenous sovereignties, settler colonialism, decolonization, critical race theory, and anarchist activism and history. She is currently based at Wesleyan University and will be starting at Princeton this fall. She co-hosted and co-produced 2 anarchist radio programs, Horizontal Power Hour from 2010 to 2013, which I was also a part of, and Anarchy on Air from 2014 to 2019, which I was also part of. She also served as the sole producer and host of a 3rd radio program called Indigenous Politics from 2007 to 2013. Kauanui has 3 books, the most recent of which is an anarchist approach to Kanaka Maoli nationalism called Paradoxes of Hawaiian Sovereignty, Land, Sex, and the Colonial Politics of State Nationalism. And last, we have William C. Anderson, writer and activist from Birmingham, Alabama. Anderson's work has been featured in The Guardian, MTV, Truth Out, British Journal of Photography, and Pitchfork. He is the author of The Nation on No Map and co-author of As Black as Resistance. And he co-founded Offshoot Journal and co-produces the Black Autonomy podcast. Thank you all for joining us. And we're going to go ahead and get started. The first question I have before we dive deep is really just to ask you to introduce yourselves, just to call in the lands and the most benevolent ancestors that are you and that are a part of you, where you're from. And can you just name and talk about the conditions that your people are facing when it comes to lands and sovereignty and liberation? And we'll just ask Kēhaulani just to begin.
Aloha, everyone. Aloha kako, Valina kako. Mahalo, Mariama, for inviting me. I'm so happy to be here with my esteemed panelists and to be in conversation with people in the audience virtually. I'm coming to you from a place traditionally known as Matabesic, the homeland of the Wangunk Indian people. And I've been here in Connecticut for 24 years. I want to move beyond land acknowledgement as just some liberal gesture to note that I've been working with some Wangunk descendants around decolonizing Indigenous Middletown, and that's been part of my, what we say in Hawaiian, kuleana, or responsibility since I've been here and been working on it slowly. I am a diasporic Kanaka Maoli. Kanaka Maoli is the Hawaiian way of saying Indigenous Native Hawaiian. And I'm Native Hawaiian on my father's side, and our family hails from all over the islands, but primarily from Maui and Molokai, but since the 1940s on Hawaiian homelands territory, which is on the island of Kauai, in our case, in the homestead called Anahola. And I bring all my kupuna, or ancestors, and the Aumakua ancestral deities, the benevolent ancestors with me, hopefully tonight. I've asked for that guidance, and also kind of oriented to these questions from a queer anarchist perspective.
Thank you. And I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about what conditions your people are facing in relation to land and sovereignty.
Right. Well, let's see. The short way of putting that is to first acknowledge that our sovereignty, in scare quotes, which is non-Westphalian ultimately, is the Hawaiian word for it is ea, which is another way of saying life force that's all interconnected. But then there's also the statist version of Hawaiian sovereignty, which is to say that in the midst and wake of Western encroachment throughout the 18th and early 19th century, Hawaiian elites founded the Hawaiian monarchy, the kingdom that was forged through 1795 to 1810 as a preemptive way to actually push back against Western imperialism. And one of the issues that I address in the book that you mentioned, Paradoxes of Hawaiian Sovereignty, is how in the process of trying to keep Westerners at bay by founding this Hawaiian kingdom, Hawaiian elites participated in what we would call today a respectability politics to gain access to the World League of Nations, if you will, to be part of what Tanya Ganella Fritzner has called the Countries Club, and to be recognized as a nation state. And forward fast, that recognition was globally in the mid-19th century. Forward fast to the late 19th century, Hawaii was subject to a US military overthrow and a military occupation starting in 1893 with US Marines toppling our reigning monarch at the time, Queen Liliuokalani. And the 13 white men that orchestrated that with the support of the US military wanted annexation right away. And there was a changing of the guards, if you will, between different presidential executives. And what you end up with 5 years later is a unilateral annexation of the Hawaiian Islands in a US joint resolution. So unilateral, and that's in 1898. And then you've got forward fast to 1959, so-called 50th statehood. So occupation, meaning in a legal sense, in terms of military occupation, 1893, unilateral annexation in 1898, and the fraudulent 50th state in 1959. And some of the most pressing issues that emerge from that all stem from land dispossession. And now we're living with a hybrid situation of US military occupation with settler colonial overlay. and the occupation part is masked and quite invisible because of the settler run. And so if you think about Palestine right now in the West Bank, right, you have an illegal military occupation that's in an occupied territory that's being flooded with settlers, and constant threats by the government to annex that territory to make it part of broader 1948 Israel. That's already happened in Hawaii, Aku, there in Hawaii.
Thank you for that introduction and for setting that context for us. I'm going to pass it to JT. Would you be able to also tell us about the lands that you come from? What are your people facing? What are they facing in relation to land and sovereignty?
Thank you so much. I'm so honored to be in conversation with you all, and really already learning so much and feel so engaged with this the vibes and the energy of this panel. I think I'm actually in my home community in Tappahannock, Virginia, in the ancestral and ongoing lands of the Rappahannock people, a group part of the wider Powhatan Confederacy. And so I want to invoke ancestrally a woman named Nan, a woman called Nan, I should say, who in 1734 attempted to burn her master's house down. And I think we sometimes we don't see that as a kind of benevolent force, but I think when we start to begin to understand the ways that what is euphemized as climate change or the Anthropocene begins with the settler onslaught in this context of Rappahannock lands in the 1650s with even by Crown standards, illegal settlements in the 1640s and 1650s, and then later by sanction, white settlement into this area. I've come to see that enslaved people had a very serious and clear understanding about the ecological and the social and all the effects of the plantation and its violences and its ecocidal and genocidal logics. And I think so when I find someone like Nan or engage, someone like Nan falls into my consciousness through archival and other kinds of research about my own home community, and I see her trying to transform the combustion of plantation society. I see that as um, an environmental and a land and another kind of claim, one that didn't necessarily, and the reason that I have it is because it was suppressed, but one that sets up from the outset of Black relationships with this land, part of the palimpsest of like it as a potentially liberatory space, as something that can be something different. Um, and so I think right now, and I wanted to start there as well, because I think right now my people face in this community, um, Black and Indigenous and poor white folks in this community face, a major conundrum. The overall majority of our land um, is agricultural and or agricultural in the sense of like tree plantations, and yet 40% I believe of children in Essex County, Virginia, experience hunger. We're literally sprayed by all the chemicals. There's no accounting for all of that. Most people have Jim Crow wells, or shallow wells. I consider them all Jim Crow, even though many of them weren't constructed in Jim Crow wells that are shallow enough that I'm pretty sure, I'm no scientist, but I'm pretty sure that synthetic fertilizers and petroleum-based chemicals are part of the reason that people experience clusters of cancer and other things in this region. And I think I've been working with Jay Richardson Grebe, Reverend Cornelius Holmes, and Chad Lewis in a formation for about 2 years now called Just Harvest, trying to build out a kind of space to build political and other kinds of and practical education about through food as a means of talking about land and changing collective approaches and understandings to land, through soil and other things, but also through the kind of layers that that we build on top of in our confrontation with the plantation order. And I'll say just very quickly, the old plantation and Jim Crow order that I've sort of mentioned as part of the infrastructural layers of this region, on top of the kind of genocidal expropriation of indigenous landscapes and all of that that preceded, and that was part of the process of the plantations mobilization, now are also being bought up as part of a green enclosure. So there's, they're hiding behind these LLCs. If you go to the property records in my home community, 900, 1,000 acres at a time, and that's only in my county. I'm sure there are other counties where there are. I mean, it's a global phenomenon in rural communities, especially in the African diaspora, of buying up forest land in the name of Green Horizon is nowhere near the kinds of issues that's going on right now in terms of the Congo, but it is related. The biofuels vision is related to this kind of ongoing vision that rural Black places are extractable, and that they can be and that they can be killed. And I think, although we need to see the connections between places like the Congo and what is both already present in the U.S. landscape proper itself, whatever they call the U.S. landscape itself, through mass incarceration. The next county over has, like 3 carceral facilities in a community that only has about 10,000 people, right? Residents that are free and that are, I guess, supposedly free. And, I think, the kind of rural plantation and extractive and disposability circuit is alive and well across the diaspora and across indigenous territories all over the globe. And I'll stop there because I could go on and on. So I appreciate you.
Thank you, JT. Thank you for setting all that context. And I'll pass it now to you, William, if you want to tell us about and call in the lands that you're from, the lands that you carry with you, and any most benevolent ancestors that you also want to call in as well. And just tell us about the conditions that your people are facing when it comes to land, liberation, and sovereignty.
Absolutely. Thank y'all for having me. I'm really honored to be participating in this event with everyone, and I'm excited to learn and hopefully grow and develop some new ideas with everybody if possible. When I usually talk about these sorts of things, I tend to focus on Alabama. I'm from Alabama. It's a place that is misnamed the heart of Dixie, in this country that is misnamed America. And I'm descended from enslaved African people who were trafficked to the South and dropped here in the midst of all sorts of horrible violence, including the genocide and displacement of Native peoples. And my people were forced to work in grotesque conditions that extend into what we can think about as the different afterlives of slavery, and these types of degradations that counter our ability to live the best life possible on these really beautiful but troubled lands. And when I'm thinking about what my people need and where we're at, I think about the history that comes with all of that. We face displacement, we face forced migration, environmental racism, and much more. My ancestors have been forced to work the land as slaves, as sharecroppers, as prisoners, and much more. And these are not, distant, far off ancestors. These are, my grandparents. These are my parents. And it's oftentimes when we, have these conversations as well, we talk about the ancestors, and we maybe imagine people that are very distant. But I like to think about the fact that, my parents grew up in the Jim Crow South and experienced Jim Crow apartheid, and their parents were engaging in this sort of work that was virtually slavery as sharecroppers. And so what do my people need? I think that my people need safety. We need autonomy. The lands that, you know, my ancestors and my family purchased and worked on was sometimes taken from them by force. You know, this is an extensive part of the history of Black folks in the US of, you know, acquiring lands and then trying to establish themselves and just to have it be taken away and by force. So it's part of the continuing ongoing dispossession that is obviously built on top of Native genocide and settler colonialism. So we've never been safe in this land, and I think that creating a new society where we could actually be safe and think about the ways that we would want to flourish and thrive is ultimately what we truly need. And I just want to call in all of the ancestors who I wish were here, like my mother, my grandmother, my grandparents, ancestors who I've never met that I wish I could meet, like my great grandparents, and so many family members who I've lost during this ongoing pandemic, and so on and so forth. The ancestors who I have good feelings about. I don't pretend that all of the ancestors are good people. So the ones that were good people that I maybe don't know, I would like to call them into the room too, because sometimes we're descended from bad folks as well, and we can talk about that as well in this conversation if y'all want to get into that.
Thank you, William. And I'm going to come back to you, Kēhaulani, and just wanted to ask you again, if you could just talk more about some of the needs that your people have. You set a context for us and historical context for us. Wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the needs that your people have and also how those needs are shaped by settler colonialism.
Sure, thank you. Going back to my earlier point around so many of what we would just flag as the classic social ills that face Kanaka Maoli people stem from land dispossession. Everything that we look at right now can be traced to that, arguably. The militarization of our lands and people. There are over 80 military installations in Hawaii. And Hawaii is a really small place. Per square footage, there's more military there, is my understanding, than any other so-called state in the union, the so-called union. And that links to some of the issues that were already raised, whether we're looking at polluted water in Red Hill that's completely through toxic military equipment leaking into the water table, or the fight against the 30-meter telescope at the sacred summit of Mauna Kea, where we've had land defenders intermittently for years try to prevent the construction of that for many reasons. Number one, it's sacred Aina, and it's a sacred Mauna for us, a sacred summit, but also it sits on a massive water aquifer. Or thinking about what's going on in Lahaina on the island of Maui since the fires in August, right? All of which could have been prevented. That was from diverted water for sugar plantations. And then you have basically all these gated communities and all the tourist industry that has, diverted what was once one of the wettest spots on the island that should never, ever be able to burn. And right now there's a big battle over who's going to rebuild Lahaina and how. And the people in control and the interface between the wealthy and the state want to actually recreate Lahaina, which was, mega tourist central, to reconstruct it in much the same way. And so those are just a few of the issues to flag, but really it's that interlink between the tourism industry and the military industrial complex and the land dispossession question, which is always already about settler colonial elimination. And I think what I might also, I don't know if this is exactly the time, but I did want to talk kind of about the concept itself of settler colonialism, because it's become so contested in many ways. And it's been through renewed contestation in relation to what's going on in Gaza right now. But in terms of, just to go head on back to your question about the needs, really ecological redress is tied up with political restitution. And for me, that means restoring Ea, not the Hawaiian Kingdom, is part of what I'm trying to get at. And when I hinted earlier about the respectability politics, what I could have gone on to say, which I'll say now, is that in order for the Hawaiian elites to secure that status of international recognition for a Hawaiian nation state, the Hawaiian Kingdom, a lot of things had to happen before that was secured, and that included the privatization of land, the legal subordination of Hawaiian women, the criminalization of a pantheon of Hawaiian sexual possibilities, the attempted eradication of people of non-binary gender, what we'd say in the 21st century, right? So people who are gender indeterminate, mahu is what our word is in Hawaiian. And so you had that around land, gender, and sexual politics being sort of the indices of what constituted a civilized Hawaiian nation. And so for me, the needs around Hawaiian land dispossession and to address that and address ecological devastation through political restitution have to include a non-statist, and for me, an anti-statist politics of restoration. And people will, inevitably say, well, restore what? It's always selective, and kind of as a gotcha moment or an aha moment, and say it's always selective. It's always selective. We already know that. That's not the aha or the gotcha. The thing is, what do we want to reclaim and why? And what kinds of principles are we relying on to do that? And that, to me, must tend to land, gender, and sexual politics in relation to ecological redress, land back, and political restitution that is not hinging on state restoration, even though at the same time tactically, and people who know my work and people who are comrades know that I talk about federal Indian policy, I talk about international law, not because I think it's the solution. I'm sort of, somewhat fixated on the law, but not because it's a solution. It's, to me, a tactic to actually call attention to the US farce. The US has no legitimate claim to Hawaii, and as I like to put it, not a penny or a puka shell was ever exchanged for the Hawaiian Islands. And none of the Hawaiian Kingdom's treaties, 5 treaties with the US government, were treaties of cession. They didn't actually relinquish any territory whatsoever. There were treaties of friendship, commerce, and navigation between 2 nation states. And so I'm happy to point that out and to draw on normative international law to expose the fraud, to expose the theft, but not because I think the solution is to be found in international law. And if we ever need a reminder of that, we can look at Palestine right now. And so with that, I guess the other thing I wanted to make sure to not lose sight of is, through that land, gender, and sexual tightening, the privatization, the enclosure of land, gender, and sexual possibility, that came with Christian colonization that was settler colonial in nature. And we're seeing different iterations of that now with the rampant expansion of evangelical Christian institutions throughout the islands, going hand in hand with a real upsurge in the so-called alt-right throughout Hawaii. Proud Boys are all over the Hawaiian Islands, and they're just growing exponentially, leaps and bounds. And there are other groups as well, but they're very notably bragging about it. And so this, has to also be, for me, anti-fascism. You can be still a statist and be anti-fascist. Anti-statism should always incorporates anti-fascism for me, because we know that the rise of fascism is typically through legislation, and in this case, liberal democracies. And so I'm interested in that connection between settler colonialism and fascism as well, but I wanted to just put that on the map for the discussion.
Thank you so much. You dropped so much on us, and I would definitely want to hold on to this idea of restoring Ea and come back to what that means throughout this conversation. I want to move us to talking about possibility, what possibilities there are, what possibilities we have for exchange. And I'm going to come back to you, JT, and can you tell us about how are we already free? What are the ways that the practices that we have, the relationships to land that we have, the kinship networks that we have that render us already free? If you could talk to us a little bit about that.
Thank you. Yeah. I said before, on my father's side is someone who evolved and sort of is present to you out of a set of people who, if they hadn't had baseline mutual aid, I wouldn't be here. If they hadn't engaged in, often fugitive practices with the land, I wouldn't be here. We have a whole repertoire of, I think, anti-statist, non-statist, critical left visions that emerge from our everyday practices in this place. And I'm reminded, we just harvest, we opened a teaching garden in the middle of our of Tappahannock recently. And I know, there's lots to say about the ways that that this kind of thing can flirt with preserving vulnerability and like only patchwork sort of getting around it through mitigation in ways that is not necessarily always helpful, or that can be taken up by different institutional spaces and rendered either useless or worse, dangerous. But I think what we are trying to do and I think build out from is kind of symbolically significant. The plot that we're working on was a Black church. We found out the land title to it from 1879, a Black Baptist church called Roane Baptist. And if you know anything about this part of Virginia, Baptist churches evolved out of brush arbors immediately after emancipation. They're the vehicle through which and a vex vehicle. I'm not being romantic about, especially the gender and sexuality politics in the long term of these institutional spaces. But before individual Black families or individuals, many of them own personal land, they collectively bought and stewarded or collectively found ways to get land that still has strange properties. It's not exactly the same kind of property. And I think there's something else that goes on when we approach, like, for example, Black church land. I have a sense, I grew up with a sense that I could, if I have at least a relatively close ancestor buried there, that I could go there. No white church yard feels that way, even for other white people. So I think that there's a way that that these parcels that people collectively bought, often with their agricultural labor, and these kind of both their own small ownership and collective working of the water and the land in this area, to build out a whole alternative vision for regional well-being and collectivity that emerged before Jim Crow, and that Jim Crow actually was responding to, right? Black oystermen, Black smallholders were working the land and using that provision to support stuff like the Rappahannock Industrial Academy and other institutions that provided secondary education, for example, before Virginia allotted for that in the 1940s. They also supported Virginia Union University, which, if you know anything about the intellectual history from civil rights into Black power in Virginia, is essential to like those liberatory struggles. So I think, we're building on a palimpsest of immediate post-emancipation life that use mutual aid and reciprocity and all of those things to get us to even have a world. And I think a world here for ourselves. And I think I also think I wanted to speak to the anti-fascism point directly as well, because this part of Virginia is rattled by I grew up with the idea that it was okay for white students to wear Confederate flags into the schools, even though, my high school was 60% Black, and yet even something small and symbolically charged as Obama t-shirts were banned immediately. And I'm not calling on Obama in a positive light, but just saying the kind of contradictions that we know. And the police, as I said, the county over from us has like 3 carceral facilities in a place where only 10,000 people are free, right? So I think I also want to invoke the histories that are often marked as outlawism in this area. I think in the wider world as well. The histories of fugitivity and I think I'll go back to the food thing. There were people in the 1760s and into the 1760s and 19th century who, under Virginia's colonial sumptuary laws, had their ears nailed to the pillory for hog stealing, were whipped with 39 lashes in public for hog stealing. We're talking about an area of the settler plantation ecological disaster that they let hogs run free and actually didn't fence them in. So hog stealing means literally you might go out in the woods and grab something that's actually running fallow. And that's considered theft because hunger is a part of the calculation and the calculus of extraction. So I think I want to invoke those people as well. Tom and Flora, two enslaved people who were called Tom and Flora, who were caught hog stealing. You can't eat a whole hog at night by yourself. More than likely, if you don't want to get caught, that's a communal hog. I want to invoke those also, though, along with mutual aid, our legacies of like doing what we need to do to feed ourselves.
Thank you, JT. Appreciate that. I'm gonna move it to you, William, if you could please just share, excuse me, share a bit about the ways that we are already free and practices that we have that we can lean on to expand.
Yeah, when I think about that question, I I'm not sure if I would describe us as already free. As much as I'd like to say that we're engaging in freeing practices and liberatory actions, I think a lot of the time when the way we constantly work together and we build together outside of the state is what helps me think about the possibility and the freeing things that we do. I believe that if we did that more proactively, that we see better results a lot of the time than the things that we oftentimes do in response to crisis. And that was a central part of the thinking um, that led up to my not my most recent book, but the book before that that I co-wrote with Zoe Samudzi as Black as Resistance. We were trying to wrestle with this idea that many people have laid out before us, like Ashanti Alston, the Black anarchist elder, that the way that Black people are sort of forced to engage with each other in times of crisis and in times of survival, which is constant and ongoing, is something akin to the politics and the practices of anarchism. And so I think that there's a lot of potential in the way that we come together when it's needed, and when there's crisis and when there's catastrophe, something that can be built off of that towards a more revolutionary and radical politic and an anti-fascist politic is absolutely essential and important, and especially in these times, because so much of the things that folks feel you have to have some sort of leftism or some sort of framework that comes out of Western radicalism. So much of what people feel you would need to get from that is already happening amongst regular folks who don't necessarily lay claim to those types of politics. And I'm not saying that people need those sorts of politics or need those sorts of ideas to be able to do those things more effectively. But what we do need is political education, and we need radicalization that concentrates and organizes those sorts of efforts in a way that actually threatens the state. because ultimately, if these things are always happening in a way that is a reaction and that is responding and not happening in a way that's proactively trying to do something that is embodying that threat that I'm talking about, then I think that that's where we can maybe not be as effective as we would hope to be. And I think that the legacy of organizations like the Black Panther Party really show us how that can play out, as well as a number of others throughout Black history and throughout several other histories. When you look at the intercommunalist work of the Black Panther Party, what they were laying out with the theory of intercommunalism, which is the name really for the survival program work, was that they were concentrating their efforts in a way to kind of pull people out of this type of reaction into these organized efforts that where they could become an example and a place where people could get resources and people could actually have something that functioned as an alternative. Ultimately, that's what I'm suggesting, is that if we want to actually be free and to go beyond doing these freeing things and engaging in these freeing practices, we want to actually be liberated. And I say that word knowing that I have my own issues with it as well in terms of what we think about as liberation. But if we want to actually have much better conditions than what we have now, there has to be an effort to create an alternative by concentrating and organizing our resources in ways, and our politics and our acts of radicalism in ways that are actually a counter to everything that's kind of dropped on top of us and called a society when it's really quite oppressive and violent.
Thank you, William, and thanks for your shifting the question the way I'm asking the question. I'm going to pass it to you again, Kēhaulani, and if you could also just share with us ways either that we're already free or freeing practices that we already have available to us, that we may already be practicing and that we can draw upon.
Yes, thank you. It really struck me listening to the opening song, I've Known Rivers, and it made me think about how waterways connect all peoples across the globe. And I don't mean that in some hokey, cheesy way. It's true, and that's why we have to be mindful of what's going in the water. Or I'm thinking about Apeli Hau'ofa, who is a Tongan cultural producer and academic and curator and choreographer, who wrote a beautiful piece called Our Sea of Islands on Oceania being a connective for the rest of the globe as the largest surface on the earth. And so thinking about the ways in which our waterways sustain us, and in connection with the aina, as we say in Hawaiian, the word for land in Hawaiian, aina, means that which feeds. And so when I read your question around, you're thinking about practices of freedom, possibility, exchange, and balance, I thought the first word that came into mind is a Hawaiian concept called pono, which means balance, and it has to do with what is restored, and it's that sort of homeostasis, if you will. But you can't have balance. The Hawaiian concept of balance was dependent on the Hawaiian principle of reciprocity. And so when you've got an extractive economy like the tourist industry, and you've got the rampant militarization on top of it, there's no reciprocity. And yet that's what Hawaii's marketed on, is Hawaiian giving, Hawaiian aloha, Hawaiian values, or some rendition or twisted notion of Hawaiian values. And so, thinking about Hawaiian concepts of reciprocity in relation to, JT mentioned mutual aid a couple times, and thinking about what that looks like in terms of resource sharing and resources flowing. Hawaiian society, like many, although not all, Indigenous societies, was and is very incorporative. And so I want to center that because in the past, when I've spoken about indigeneity and not just Hawaiian indigeneity, I have, and I won't name, I had a very well-known radical Black scholar come up and talk to me afterward and said, I really appreciate that you mentioned sort of the inclusive nature, because what I was talking about is, so there's land restoration projects going on all over Hawaii, pulling out invasive species, replanting kalo, also known as taro, trying to clean up waterways, come one, come all, but it's grounded in Hawaiian principles. It's not Hawaiian exclusive, but it's grounded in the principles of the Aina, which is Kanaka Maoli in terms of the guiding mandate for the Aina. What it calls for are people who actually stewarded that land for thousands of years and knew how, not just did it, but knew how. Food was abundant. And so, but that person came up to me and said, when I hear indigeneity, I feel like, I'm being relegated back to the Middle Passage. And, that really kind of, I had to catch my breath on that. And I thought, if that's what you're hearing, like we need to look at that. And we also need to address anti-Blackness in all our communities and all the structures built on enslavement and also built on genocide. But, that's the idea around the incorporative nature is come one, come all. The elimination, the settler colonial elimination, what sets Indigenous peoples apart as a fourth world rather than a third world, is that elimination project to reduce Indigenous peoples, typically, not always, to a minority in their own homeland. That's the settler colonial goal, right? And that's whether we're looking at Patrick Wolf's definition of settler colonialism or Haunani K. Trask's definition of settler colonialism, or Fayez Sagay in Palestine, his definition of settler colonialism, different than some of the other definitions circulating where people are using it to talk about any colony that had settlers. I'm reserving it for a colonial project that has elimination as its goal, elimination and replacement. And so thinking about scarcity in that context and what does it mean to treat one group as targeted for elimination as the genocidal project, which is the Indigenous piece, and then genocide for those rendered surplus, right, in terms of the anti-Black world that we live in, and not just in the US, but thinking about genocide on both counts, but with different guiding logics. And so for me, thinking about what it means to actually do this work, to go back to the minority status, is that what I see people back home doing, for example, is come one, come all, because people want help, number one, and it's going to take that to live in the islands together. I could also give examples of land back struggles that I'm researching all across North America, which have been, for the most part, explicitly, gosh, the word inclusion has been so corrupted and bankrupt, we need another word for it, but has been explicitly naming the inclusion of Black people and Black and African descendants, but to really think about land beyond property regimes, and also think about what land back means is come one, come all. And in the Hawaiian context, there's always with this, without exception, really, is everyone eats, right? Everyone eats. And that's that community piece that JT mentioned with regard to the pig, which in Hawaiian is the sacred pua'a. And that word pua'a actually is part of the root, is one of the words of the word ahupua'a, which are our traditional land divisions. So if you think of an island in a kind of a circle, we have these ahupua'a traditional land divisions, and they're marked by boundary markers in honor of pua'a, our pig deity. And the idea is about resource sharing. So sure, we had a hierarchical society. I want to be really upfront about that. But so we had a paramount chief on each island, pre-monarchical, and that chief could be of any gender. Notice I didn't say either gender, but any gender. There's more than two. But within each ahupua'a, we have the konohiki, which is the land steward manager, if you will, or resource manager. And that's about getting resources from the mountain to the sea and vice versa. And so for me, that's still embedded in our Hawaiian ways of thinking and logics. Whether people are prohibited from exercising that is another issue. There are people trying to fight for customary practices and customary rights to actually be able to go gather medicine, gather food, have coastal access, and so on. But the idea is that everyone eats. I mean, food is such a way of, for Hawaiians, and that's the incorporative part too. It's like you bring people in, yeah. In the days of old, you brought them in, you fed them, you slept with them, and you kind of made them part of your crew, right? And so part of that is, I'm being partially facetious, right? The idea you give them a Hawaiian name, it's that idea of there's a way to bring people in, and we didn't have social taboos around so-called outsiders. And so for me, what does that look like is drawing on the principles and what the principles offer and how we might rethink them in our contemporary context and, retool them accordingly. I think about that with, just to go back to the gender and sexuality question for a minute, we had a practice where if somebody gave birth to somebody who had unknown paternity, and say there were two possible fathers in question, both were obligated to the child and the person who gave birth to that child, both. And so today, if I bring that example, people will go, oh, whatever, you just do a DNA test and And I'm like, you're kind of missing the point. There's no such thing as an illegitimate child in the Hawaiian world. That's perverse. That means that child draws on two vast lineages and two extended kin, plus the kin of the person who birthed them. So you're talking three massive, in theory, three massive extended ohana or family. Look at the principles that guide that idea. Sure, we can get a DNA test. That's not the point. The point is there's no such thing as an illegitimate child. And so I just wanted to think about that with the idea of feeding. Even our word for adopting people is hanai, which means to feed. And, you talked about starvation, JT, and we're seeing that, of course. I appreciate the historical example you brought up, and we're seeing that right now in Gaza, live streaming. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Kēhaulani. Time is moving very quickly. I want to move us to one last question before we move to a Q&A and allow all folks in the space to engage with us a little bit more. I'm going to come back to you, JT, and I'm going to kind of combine these last two questions that I have so we can leave space for questions. What do we need to root out? What do we need to root out in order for, especially Black and Indigenous people, those of us who have been, colonized by U.S. settler colonialism? What's dividing us, and what do we need to be rooted together? What do we need to root out? Or maybe rooted together, that just kind of came out. And also, what do we need to exchange? What can we share and what can we exchange?
Thank you. I think a couple of the biggest hindrances, I think, to all our collective embrace of what William was discussing in terms of, revolutionary intercommunalism and the possibilities for that, for kinship, that we're kind of centering across the conversation, I think is one, faith in the state is a dangerous I don't know what the right word is, but a dangerous lead in terms and a trap in many ways, because we know, especially if we're talking about the U.S., that it's on the wrong side of everything in relation to people's sovereignty and well-being and reciprocities and collectivities, and I think related to that is uprooting the kind of the reactionary version of the kind of intercommunalism that isolates us into localisms that can't be bridged or thought across or imagined beyond certain limits. I wanted to invoke Kēhaulani, the way that you described it also invoked for me June Jordan's sort of call at a certain point in the 1980s for us to return to kinship ways and other means, and to reimagine them, not to like interpret them as kind of whole cloth into the present, but to kind of, rigorously reimagine what they might look like and what they might feel like, those kinds of intimacies and those kinds of collectivities and kinships, and drawing us forward. And I think we have to hold on to like local and place and like our sense of like the palimpsests of community and freedom and all of that that are part of the layers of the places that are also colonized and extracted and violated. And I think we need to also reimagine our kind of collectivities outside of reactionary globalization, right? How do we, now that the velvet glove of neoliberal multiculturalism is off and we just have full-on fascist, iron fist fascism, this is particularly imperative. Like, how do we both hold on to our local networks, our communities, our senses of family and kinship, but also bridge beyond that to make kin beyond that, in ways that, again, that can challenge these reactionary visions of hyper local and linguistic violence and other kinds of exclusivity and that come with settler forms of violence, but also just gender racial capitalist structures with the settler state and outside of that particular framework and formulation.
Thank you, JT. Appreciate that. Going to move to you, William, if you could, with also being a little bit mindful of the time so we can include some more questions in the space before we close. If you could just share a little bit more about what's dividing us, what needs to be rooted out to get to these places that we're talking about, to be able to lean more into these practices of freedom. And what is it that we can exchange? What can we share with each other in this walk towards a freer place?
Yeah, I would say I think we're challenged at this time to rethink how we approach an attempt to possibly reform and rehabilitate the terms. Before this event, I was actually watching a clip of Speaker Mike Spencer making comments directed at the ICC about how the US should punish them with sanctions for having the audacity to issue arrest warrants for Israeli officials. And he basically said, if they can go after Israel, they'll come after the US government too. And something that I've been wrestling with is this idea that oppression generates virtue and a sort of natural morality and goodness. And I think whether people express it that way or not, particularly in leftist spaces and the type of spaces we might frequent, that because we come together as oppressed people, there's this idea that because we come together as oppressed people with liberatory desires that we're irreproachable, or we might have some sort of inherent innocence. And the reason I think that that's relevant here, given the things I was just talking about, is because when you look at the US and Israel's genocide against Palestinian people, both of these states, the US and Israel, have origin stories of groups of people fleeing persecution and genocide and feeling entitled to do whatever they please, including committing their own genocides to establish states. And so for Israel, that's rooted in the Holocaust and centuries of anti-Semitism. And for the US, there's the Pilgrims fleeing the persecution of the English state church and as well as the monarchy. And you move up in time and you see the baggage of the Enlightenment. So much of the baggage of the Enlightenment and this sort of justification carrying over and even into socialist state building projects and histories. So we have an obligation, I feel, not to repeat this and not to think that because we are oppressed and because we have experienced trauma, that is going to generate some sort of inherent virtue and guiltlessness and liberatory practice in whatever we do. if we're talking about ecology, my relationship with social ecology, for instance, is largely from Modibo Kadali. And he's influenced by the ideas of C.L.R. James and Murray Bookchin, among other people. And, you know, he acknowledges that the social and gender and political and economic and class hierarchies that, you know, create all of these problems and the conditions that we're facing that are harming the environment and creating so many catastrophes, you know, that these struggles for liberation that we're engaging in are ecological struggles because they require us to challenge these colonial creations and formations like the state and borders and so on and so forth. And what he puts forth as an idea to work through this is something that he calls intimate direct democracy, which is a practice he says, you know, emphasizes personal relationships and mutual respect as a way of trying to circumvent the desires for power and domination that come up, you know, among us oftentimes, even in our most egalitarian spaces and ideas. So I think that we have to establish real relationships with one another that acknowledge what we're facing and what we're up against, and not get caught up in the idea that we are inherently virtuous because we want to overcome these situations. There are a lot of people, regardless of race, gender, and, you know, all sorts of different things with regard to identity, regardless of all of that, we are not inherently virtuous just because we've been oppressed. We have to actually have principles. You know, Kēhaulani was talking about principles. We actually have to have principles and politics that are based on overcoming the conditions that are on top of us right now, that are from below, and that you know, work to overthrow what's on top of us, not just think that, you know, we're inherently good.
Thank you for that, William. And I'm going to end with you, Kēhaulani, before we are able to take some questions from the audience before our stop time at 8:30. It's coming so quickly. If you could just share with us what needs to be rooted out in order for us to move to a more free place, for us to be able to be in a harmonious place. And also, what is it that we can exchange with each other?
I think for me, I think I'll start from what I think we need and then kind of trace the genealogy back to what needs to be eliminated or eradicated, right? And so for me, the starting point right now is beyond the settler colonial state. And for that, that's land back, that's indigenous land back, and that's abolition. And both of them together in an anti-statist framework. People are talking about land back, but not necessarily in an anti-statist way. And there are plenty of leftists who are talking about abolition, but not in an anti-statist way. So for me, those two are, for me right now, thinking about the pillars, and that has to do with eradicating the logics of genocide and elimination of indigenous peoples and eradicating anti-Blackness in terms of the afterlife of slavery, and thinking about the hegemonic kind of common sense notion of the disappearing native that persists in our social world, as well as the grotesque racist violence of disposability that's imposed on Black people. And all with that is for me about starting with the place where we're at, whose homelands we're actually on. I identify as Indigenous. I'm part of a settler colonial structure here on Wangunk territory. It doesn't matter really what my identity is, that my dad is a colonial migrant, my mom's a white American. I'm part of a settler colonial, not just a logic, but a structure here in Mattabesset. And so for me, it's about tending to place and being attentive to the historical genealogies that brought me here, and to think about that in relation to, in this case, Wangunk people. When I go to Princeton, I'll have to sort that out in terms of thinking about what that means with Lenape polities and peoples. It can get very complicated because you have federally recognized Native governing entities, you have non-recognized communities and descendants. And so, you know, we mentioned Indigenous sovereignties. it can be really difficult. And that's beyond what we're talking about with federal acknowledgement or federal recognition, but what does that mean in the everyday sense? And so to me, that a lot of those issues have to be sorted out. And I don't know that claiming kinship, I think it can go a long way, but I think that also comes with great responsibility around cultural specificity. And that's as specific as what it means to be on any given land base and what the actual mandates are for living in that place. And so I think about that. I did want to put in the chat box an essay, a linked essay to Joy Lehuanani Enomoto wrote a beautiful essay on Blackness and anti-Blackness in the Hawaiian context. And I just wanted to share that as a resource. But in terms of your question about exchanging, Mariama, I think part of that really has to be rooted in mutual aid. But again, attentive to place and peoplehood. And this is one place where I push back on a lot of the anarchist doxa that's against the notion of peoplehood, or even because it just smacks of a nationalism that people are quite allergic to, because often people think of nationalism as an ethno-exclusive project or assume that there's some kind of state lurking in the background. But as I've been writing about for quite a while, that is not necessarily the case. That's the Western version. Yeah, I think you can't get away from that. And also thinking about what it means to be attentive to place and land, where people will push back against any kind of territorialism or borders. But again, what does it mean to be in relation to place and to steward a place without acknowledging the people of the land? So I think that's, in the interest of time, I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much to our panelists. This was a really rich and deep discussion. We've touched on so many things. I'm going to move to Q&A and also just want to continue to be mindful of the language justice that is still currently happening right now. And so if you have a question or ask a question, just continue to be mindful of the pace and the way that you speak, so that folks can continue to keep the language justice and accessibility flowing. But the first question that I see from Mohit Mukim, I'm actually going to, Mohit, allow you to speak so that you can ask your question. You're up.
Hi, you all. Thank you. Very grateful to be part of this gathering. I guess I'm just curious about the possibility of basically ending or escaping US colonial rule in any of its territories in the near future. I live in Region or Oakland right now and wonder about secessionist movements, especially, let's say, after a Trump election in November, might motivate more people to want to leave. I don't know if that's a coalition to rely on, but yeah, just kind of curious about building non-statist solidarity-based sovereignties in its stead, and whether you think that's really possible in our lifetime.
I'll allow anyone to feel free to chime in and answer as you want.
I guess what I would say in that moment, to me, that's kind of the flip side of the green enclosure that J.T. Roane, people talk about reclaiming the commons. And unless you're indigenous to that land, it's claiming condoms, Freudian slip. It's claiming commons. You know, the British brought the concept of commons with them. It's a colonial construct if you're talking about it anywhere in the Americas, and it's not. It's a bypass. It's a bypass around indigenous sovereignties. And so I think, for me, that issue of secession, I think it's a real question. So it's not to complicate the question so much as to complicate the answer of secessionist movements. Is again, where are the indigenous polities in that picture? I'm familiar with the Sigorte Land Trust and thinking about what Ohlone people are doing, or the Ohlone women led land trust and land restoration movement there, and protecting the shell mounds. But I don't know, for me, can't get away from that settler colonial piece and the indigenous piece. And so I think that for me is I'd want to kind of link that together one way or another to try and figure out what it is that people who are talking about it. There's the secessionists on the right, and there's those, you know, on different aspects of the left. So I think for that, I would want to understand more about the specificity of what kind of campaign or project people are promoting in that particular place.
Thank you. And I'm also wondering if JT, if you wanted to add anything, Kēhaulani's bringing up this concept of the commons. Just wondering if you had anything to add or wanted to respond.
Yeah, I mean, I mobilized the Black commons as a way of thinking about the relationships that are fugitive and not claims on a kind of firm territoriality whatsoever. And so I think it's, you know, there still needs a point of translation between those, but I don't think about plotting in the Black commons and the kind of genealogy of Black land practices that come out of them as even having a stable reference to property or any of that in a particular kind of way. And so there's it like similarly as we've been talking throughout this, I think drawing out the ethos of that formulation to think about what it means in our own present. Because I think, you know, there's I think in all kinds of ways, claims to certain kinds of landed sovereignty and nativism and other things that are uncritical can be treacherous, deadly and deadly and treacherous as the full brunt of the settler state itself, right? And what I mean by that is weaponized by that formulation to make sure that those same enclosures happen through without the presence of the settler of any settler in the kind of direct way or sense. So I think I think we do have to. Is it possible in our lifetime? We have to make it possible in our lifetime. I don't think that the in you know, with the caveats that we put on the table, I don't think that, you know, there is an earth with U.S. sovereignty into the forever horizon. That's not a possible thing, right? In terms of the military bases and just their ecological catastrophic profile all over the world, that's enough to condemn the apparatus, let alone what happens here. So I think I think we have no choice but to court the end of that formulation. I do think, again, that's why I put on the table at the beginning when I was doing my ancestral calls. Again, you know, people who are organized at the level of like regions and other things, they were thinking about infrastructures. They were thinking about how do you build collectivity and mutual aid and possibility, not necessarily with a stable reference to property and land. And even when they did think they had one, they didn't because of the settler states, anti-Black logics. How do you move something? So I think that's you know, yeah, I think that's we have to court it. There is a practice of the Black commons. The Black commons was always also in translation and dialogue with indigenous communities in this area. The line between Black and indigenous people in the Tidewater, Virginia, is a very complicated one, and I'm invoking this because I think it gets back to the question of like secessionists and nativisms and other kinds of formulations of like hyper local that can devolve into more violence rather than something potentially liberatory. You know, it's the settler states' weaponization through eugenics laws in the 1920s of Black and indigenous separation that that makes the genealogy like an isolated one that pulls that apart, that tries to pretend. And you know, so I think that's what I'm trying to get at is certain kinds of claims to these kind of formulations are often techniques that that this particular entity in the US has used everywhere, right? To disaggregate possible collectives, possible radical collectives for its own ends, for extraction of resources and people, and the disregard for every kind of sovereignty, like just at the baseline bodily sovereignty, but every kind of sovereignty.
Thank you, JT. Looks like we have time for one more question. Looks like Bella got Bella's answer in the chat. So we're gonna move to Christopher Lawrence. I'm going to allow you to speak and ask your question.
Thank you. Greetings, and thank you for the space that you all have curated here. One thing that has become clear from this conversation is that epistemologies lie at the forefront of these movements beyond the celibate state. My question is, how do we negate Western epistemologies such as time, land, place, or borders in the day-to-day praxis? And here I'm thinking about A Different Drummer by William Melvin Kelly or The Day of Absence by Douglas Turner Ward, and how this praxis may help us to embrace a new humanism that is extended beyond humans to the environment that we all inhabit together, and also the animals that are in that environment.
I can begin to take a stab at that. I recently interviewed, well, not recently, it was actually a few years ago, but I recently published an interview I did with the Guyanese elder, UC Kwayana. And he is someone who has an extensive and phenomenal history, thinking across many of the subjects we're covering. And his revolutionary history is just phenomenal. And I wanted to interview him to talk to him about Walter Rodney and the revolutionary parties in Guyana and the different things that he lived through and experienced. And I really also wanted to get his his answers about the state, because he was somebody that was in multiple, parties in Guyana and lived through these revolutionary periods and had spent time as a statesman and formed multiple organizations. And I kept, kind of talking with him and asking him across numerous conversations, what do you think about the state? What do you think about the state? Like, what's the answer about the state? And he assured me that the state question, well, first he said the state was only ever really going to be a tool of repression because that's what it's for. But he told me, he said, I don't answer this question as an individual. I can't answer this question as an individual. These questions aren't answered by individuals. They're answered by people and by community. And that really stuck with me, and it's become a kind of a personal mandate for how I want to move throughout the world and throughout struggle. I think that the answer to the question is answered in struggle, because the conditions, when I spoke earlier and I said that I had some hesitancy around the word liberation, that's kind of what I was trying to get at. Because a lot of times when we talk about liberation in these spaces, people have a predetermined idea of what the end result is going to be. And it's very much a problem that is in Western radicalism. People have already decided what liberation is. Even when you hear people talk about state socialist projects, they say the people of X country were liberated by X revolution. And it's like, okay, everything's done. There's no more work to do, the way that they talk about it. So I feel like this is an ongoing, long struggle that is based on conditions that are constantly changing. So we have to take an approach where we are really careful about how we talk about liberation, how we talk about freedom, how we talk about struggle, because the answers to all of the questions, whether it's land and borders and sovereignty, whether it's autonomy, capitalism, whatever we're facing off with, whatever we have questions about, is answered by these conditions that are constantly changing that we can't foresee. And we have to be engaged in struggle. We have to be engaged in those intimate relationships. Like I was talking about earlier, we have to be a part of movement and be sincere and genuine about it to be able to answer those questions, because we can't sit back and see what's happening without actually being actively engaged in a way that will give us the solutions or the practices necessary in the moment.
Thank you, William. And you took us perfectly to 8:30. Thank you all so much. Also don't know if I said that this was organized by the Black Land Liberation Initiative. We're a project of C2. And we have a website that is forthcoming, and we will be sharing the link to our website so you can stay in touch with us and learn more about our work. And we can share more resources with you when we send the recording of this webinar out to folks. I am going to let our interpreters go and also say thank you so much. This was our first time doing this. I know that we definitely had some technical difficulties, but thank you so much to the interpreters for all the work that you did tonight to make this a more accessible space and to just dismantle the hegemony of the English language. That felt important to do in a panel about settler colonialism. So thank you all. I am going to leave this room open for just 5 more minutes, just if folks have, want to connect with each other, share resources before we close the chat. I'm going to put on some music, but thank you to the interpreters. They're going to leave now, so this won't be an interpreted space anymore. But we will leave the chat open for just 5 more minutes if anyone just wants to exchange any more resources. Thank you.